In the hushed, sacred space of the practice room, Ilara felt more herself than anywhere else on earth. The room, tucked away at the end of a long, echoing corridor in the prestigious Northwood Conservatory, was her sanctuary. It smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint, dusty scent of sheet music that had been handled for generations. A single, large window looked out onto the sprawling, leaf-green quad, but Ilara rarely noticed the world outside. Her world was here, in front of the gleaming, black expanse of the grand piano. She was 17, a girl of average height with a tendency to slouch as if trying to make herself smaller. Her hair was a plain brown, usually pulled back in a messy bun, and her clothes were simple and functional. She was the kind of person who would easily blend into a crowd, disappearing into the background. But the moment her fingers touched the ivory keys, she became someone else entirely. She became a storyteller, her hands, which often seemed clumsy and awkward when she was fumbling with a book or tying her shoelaces, moved over the keys with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. She wasn't just playing the notes written on the page, was conversing with them. She would lean into the piano, her eyes closed, her body swaying with the music as if it were a gentle current. A melody wasn't just a sequence of pitches to her. It was a question, a sigh, a burst of joy, a cry of despair. She could make the instrument weep with a soft, sustained chord or laugh with a cascade of light, tinkling notes. The other students at the conservatory knew about her. They would sometimes stop outside the door of her practice room, not to mock or interrupt, but just to listen. They called her the quiet girl with the storm inside her, a moniker she never knew, but that perfectly captured the essence of her talent. Her music was the only place where the storm was allowed to break free. This raw, emotional gift was what had brought her to the attention of Madame Dubois. The teacher was a legend at Northwood, a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. Madame Dubois had been a concert pianist of some renown in her youth, a woman who had played in the great halls of Europe. But her career had been short-lived, ending in a haze of whispered rumors about her temperamental nature and uncompromising artistic vision. Now, in her late 60s, she was a fixture at the conservatory, a stern, impeccably dressed woman with silver hair pulled into a tight chignon and eyes that missed nothing. She walked the corridors as if she were a queen inspecting her domain, her posture ramrod straight, her hands often clasped behind her back. She believed that music was a science of precision, a mathematical architecture of sound. Emotion, in her view, was a messy, indulgent variable that needed to be controlled. If not entirely eliminated, their weekly lessons were a tense dance of opposing philosophies. Ilara would arrive with a piece she had poured her heart into, a Chopin nocturne or a Debussy arabesque that she had made her own. She would play, pouring all of her unspoken feelings into the music, letting the piano speak for her. For a few minutes, the small, sterile lesson room would be filled with beauty, but when the final note faded, the silence would be broken by Madame Dubois's voice, sharp and cold as shattered glass. Sentimental, she would say, tapping a long, manicured finger on the polished wood of her desk. You lingered on that fermata as if you were starring in a cheap melodrama. This is Chopin, not a soap opera. The emotion is in the structure, in the harmony. It is not in your feelings. Another time, after Ilara had poured her soul into a particularly heart-wrenching passage, Madame Dubois simply sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. Technically adequate, she said, the words landing like a stone. But you play like a child. You wear your heart on your sleeve. True artistry requires a suit of armor. You must learn to detach, to become a master of the notes, not their slave. Ilara would shrink under the criticism. The warmth that had filled her while playing would drain away, leaving her feeling cold and small. She would nod, her gaze fixed on her own scuffed shoes, unable to meet her teacher's piercing eyes. She respected Madame Dubois. The woman was a master of technique, and her knowledge of music theory was encyclopedic. A part of Ilara, a desperate, uncertain part, wondered if her teacher was right. Maybe her passion was a flaw. Maybe her natural instinct to pour emotion into the music was a sign of immaturity, a weakness she needed to overcome. So she tried. She practiced scales and exercises with a new, rigid discipline, trying to empty her mind of feeling and focus only on the perfect execution of each note. But the music would feel dead under her fingers, and the joy would go out of it. Leaving only a sense of dutiful labor, the annual winter showcase was looming, casting a long shadow over the entire conservatory. It was the biggest event of the year, a formal concert where the most promising students performed for faculty, critics, and talent scouts. Posters were plastered on every bulletin board, and the air buzzed with nervous energy. For Alara, it was a source of both excitement and dread. She dreamed of sharing her music, of connecting with an audience the way she connected with the piano. But she also knew that Madame Dubois would be watching, judging her every move, every note. The pressure was immense, and the tension between her own artistic soul and her teacher's rigid dogma felt like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter, ready to snap. She had been working for months on a complex sonata, a piece that allowed for both technical brilliance and deep emotional expression. She thought, or perhaps just hoped, that she had finally found a way to balance the two, to please her teacher without losing herself in the process. She was wrong. The real test, the one she never saw coming, was just around the corner. The day of the winter showcase arrived with a crisp, biting wind that rattled the old windows of the conservatory. Inside, however, the atmosphere was thick and warm, buzzing with a nervous energy that felt almost electric. Students in formal attire, the boys in stiff collars and the girls in simple dresses, scurried through the hallways like startled birds. The air smelled of hairspray, floor wax, and the faint metallic scent of fear. For Alara, it felt like walking through a dream. She had chosen her plainest blue dress, one that didn't draw any attention, and had pinned her brown hair up as neatly as she could. Her hands felt cold and clammy, and she kept wiping them on the fabric of her skirt. A nervous habit she couldn't seem to break, she was waiting in the designated holding area for the performers, a large room filled with chairs where students sat in small, whispering clusters. Everyone was running through their pieces in their heads, their fingers twitching on their knees. Alara tried to do the same, picturing the opening bars of the sonata she had perfected, the one she and Madame Dubois had worked on for months. She could feel the music in her bones, the way the first theme flowed into the second, the technical challenge of the development section, the quiet beauty of the adagio movement. She had poured everything into it, trying to find the perfect balance between the technical precision her teacher demanded and the emotional expression that felt like her lifeblood. She thought she had finally found it. A small, fragile flicker of hope burned in her chest. Maybe tonight she could make Madame Dubois proud. Maybe tonight she could finally prove she was worthy. Just as she was starting to feel a semblance of calm, a younger student poked her head into the room. "Alara?" The girl called out, her voice small. "Madame Dubois wants to see you in her office immediately." A ripple of silence spread through the room. All eyes turned to her. A last-minute summons from the teacher was not a good sign. It was never a good sign. Ilara's heart, which had been beating a little too fast, now felt like it was trying to hammer its way out of her chest. She nodded mutely, her throat too tight to speak, and stood up on legs that suddenly felt like jelly. The walk down the corridor had never felt so long. The polished floors seemed to stretch on forever, reflecting the overhead lights in a dizzying glare. With each step, her mind raced. What had she done wrong? Was her posture off? Was there a mistake in her interpretation that she had missed? She ran through the entire piece in her mind, note by note, searching for the flaw, the fatal error that had earned her this pre-performance summons. When she reached the heavy oak door of Madame Dubois's office, she hesitated, her hand hovering in the air. She took a deep, shaky breath and knocked. Enter. The voice was as sharp and cold as ever. Alara pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as she remembered it, immaculate, sterile, and intimidating. Towering bookshelves lined every wall, filled with scores and treatises on music theory. A large mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface perfectly clear except for a single, elegant fountain pen and a stack of papers aligned at a perfect right angle. The air smelled of old paper and the faint, floral perfume that Ilara associated with her teacher's presence. Madame Dubois was sitting behind the desk, her back ramrod straight, her silver hair coiled in a severe chignon. She didn't look up immediately, instead finishing the notation she was making on a sheet of paper with a precise, final stroke. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, amplifying Ilara's anxiety until it was almost unbearable. Finally, Madame Dubois placed the cap on her pen and looked up, her pale eyes pinning Ilara in place. "You are nervous?" she stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, madame," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Nervousness is a luxury. A true artist has confidence in her preparation." Madame Dubois gestured to the single chair in front of her desk. "Sit." Ilara sat down on the very edge of the chair, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt like a student being called before the principal. "I have been thinking," Madame Dubois began, her tone measured and deliberate, "about your performance tonight, about the sonata you have prepared." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "It is a good piece. Technically, you have mastered it. But it is safe, it is comfortable. It does not challenge you. And more importantly, it will not challenge the audience." Ilara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. I thought it was what you wanted," she stammered. "It is what I thought you were capable of," Madame Dubois corrected her coolly. "But I believe you are capable of more. The world does not need more pleasant music. It needs brilliance. It needs to be shocked into feeling. And you, my dear, have been hiding behind your pretty little melodies for too long." She reached into a drawer of her desk and pulled out a sheaf of sheet music. She didn't hand it to Ilara. Instead, she slid it across the polished surface of the desk. It came to a stop right in front of her. Ilara looked down at the title and her blood ran cold. La Campanella by Franz Liszt. She knew the piece. Every piano student knew the piece. It was a legend, a monster of a composition notorious for its blinding speed, its terrifying jumps, and its relentless, demanding technicality. It was the kind of piece that only virtuosos, the best of the best, would even attempt to play in public. It was a piece designed to show off, to dazzle, to push a pianist to their absolute limit. She had never even considered playing it. It was completely and utterly beyond her. I can't," she breathed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Madame, I haven't practiced this." "I don't know it. It's impossible." "Nothing is impossible for a student with true potential," Madame Dubois said, her voice hardening. "This is not a request. It is a test. A final lesson. The sonata you prepared is an exercise in feeling. This," she tapped a long, manicured nail on the cover of the Liszt score, "this is an exercise in steel. It will strip away all your sentimental indulgences and leave only what is essential: precision, discipline, and raw talent. Either you have it or you do not. Tonight you will show everyone which it is." Ilara stared at the music, the black notes on the page swimming before her eyes. They looked like a swarm of angry insects. She felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sense of unreality. This couldn't be happening. It was a mistake. A cruel joke. She looked up at her teacher, searching her face for some sign of mercy, some hint that this was just a twisted form of encouragement. But there was none. There was only a cold, hard certainty, a look of someone who had just lit a match to see if a moth would fly into the flame. Slowly, her hands trembling, Ilara reached out and picked up the pages. The paper felt thin and flimsy, but it weighed a ton. She stood up, her mind a complete blank. She didn't know what to say, what to do. She felt like she was drowning. As she turned to leave, Madame Dubois spoke again, her voice louder this time, sharp enough to cut through the heavy wooden door. "This will be a very valuable lesson in humility for our young prodigy." Ilara froze. Through the slightly open door, she heard a sudden silence from the corridor outside. She knew other students were there, waiting. She knew they had heard. Her face burned with a shame so deep it felt physical. It wasn't just a private challenge anymore. It was a public declaration. Her teacher wasn't just testing her. She was setting her up for a spectacular, humiliating failure. She was making an example of her doubt without another word. Ilara walked out of the office, clutching the impossible music in her hands. She didn't look at the other students in the hallway. She couldn't. She just kept walking, her feet moving automatically, carrying her back toward the holding room, back toward the stage, back toward the abyss. The cheerful buzz of the audience, the faint sound of an orchestra tuning up, it all seemed to be coming from another world, a world she no longer belonged to. She was alone, armed with a weapon she didn't know how to use, sent into a battle she was designed to lose. The world had become a muted watercolor. The sharp edges of the corridor, the concerned faces of her peers, the frantic energy buzzing in the air, it all blurred into a nonsensical smear. Ilara moved through it all like a ghost, her body operating on some forgotten autopilot while her mind was trapped, replaying the scene in Madame Dubois's office on a relentless, horrifying loop. The sheets of paper in her hand felt less like music and more like a legal document, a contract for her own public execution. The edges dug into her palms, a small, sharp pain that was the only thing anchoring her to reality. She found her way back to the performer's holding room, but the sanctuary it had once offered was gone. Now it felt like a cage filled with other trapped animals, all of them sensing the impending doom of one of their own. The whispers stopped the moment she entered. A dozen pairs of eyes swiveled toward her, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and even a little bit of cruel anticipation in their gazes. They knew, of course, they knew. News traveled like lightning in the close-knit world of the conservatory. Someone had overheard. Someone had seen her emerge from the office, pale and shaking, clutching the infamous list score. The verdict was already in. She was the sacrificial lamb of the evening. Ilara ignored them all. She found a small, empty corner and sank into a chair, her back against the cool wall. She stared down at the pages on her lap. The notes weren't notes. They were a swarm of black, angry insects, crawling all over the page, making no sense. She tried to focus, to find a starting point, a familiar chord, anything she could hold on to. But her eyes wouldn't cooperate. The notes swam and danced, mocking her. She could hear Madame Dubois's voice in her head, cold and clear as a winter morning. This will be a very valuable lesson in humility. The words were a poison, seeping into her confidence, curdling it into self-doubt. Asterisk, was she right? A small, terrified voice inside her asked. Asterisk, am I just a sentimental child who needs to be taught a lesson? Have I been fooling myself all this time? Asterisk, a wave of nausea washed over her. She thought of her parents sitting out there in the audience, their faces filled with hopeful pride. They had saved for months to afford the tickets and her new dress. They believed in her, in the quiet girl who could make magic with a piano. How could she face them after this? How could she walk off that stage, having failed so publicly, so completely? The image of their disappointed faces was more painful than the thought of the audience's laughter. She closed her eyes, trying to block it all out, and a memory surfaced, unbidden, from the depths of her mind. She was 9 years old, sitting at her grandmother's old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano. It was a sunny afternoon, and dust motes danced in the beam of light slanting through the living room window. There was no one watching, no pressure, no expectations. She was just messing around, her small hands experimenting with chords, making up a little melody. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was simple, a little clumsy, but it was hers. And as she played, she felt a pure, uncomplicated joy that filled her entire being. It was the feeling of creating something beautiful, just for the sake of it. It was the reason she had fallen in love with the piano in the first place, long before scales and sonatas and formidable teachers had entered her life. That memory, so vivid and warm, was a lifeline. For a brief moment, the crushing weight on her chest lifted. The anger she had been suppressing, the deep, unfair hurt of what her teacher had done, began to bubble up. It wasn't a fiery rage, but a quiet, steady flame of defiance. This isn't about humility, she thought, her fingers tightening on the pages. This is about cruelty. Madame Dubois hadn't done this to teach her. She had done it to break her, to prove a point about her own rigid, joyless philosophy, but the flame of anger was quickly extinguished by a cold wave of fear. Defiance was a luxury she couldn't afford. It didn't change the fact that in a matter of minutes, she would be expected to play one of the most difficult pieces ever written, a piece she had never practiced. Her brief moment of clarity was replaced by a dizzying panic. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She could feel a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her hands, which should have been warming up, flexing, preparing, were ice-cold and stiff. She tried to make a fist, but her fingers wouldn't obey. From the main auditorium, she could hear the muffled sound of applause. Another student had finished their performance. It was followed by the polite, distant voice of the announcer. Each name called was a tick of a clock counting down to her own doom. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching a movie of a girl in a blue dress, about to have her life ruined. The girl looked small and fragile, and a part of Ilara ached for her. Then she heard it. The name that wasn't a name, but a sentence. And now, performing for us on the grand piano, Ilara. A collective, almost inaudible gasp seemed to ripple through the holding room. This was it. The moment of truth. A stagehand appeared at the door, gesturing for her. It was time to walk the plank. She stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She left the dreaded list score on the chair. She wouldn't need it. She couldn't read it anyway. It would just be a prop in her tragic little play. As she walked down the short, narrow hallway that led to the side of the stage, the sounds of the auditorium grew louder. The polite clapping died down, replaced by a sea of whispers. The heavy velvet curtain felt like a barrier between two worlds. On one side was the backstage chaos, her private hell. On the other was the stage, the public one. The stagehand gave her a small, sympathetic nod and pulled back the curtain. The sudden wall of light was blinding. Hot, white, and intense, it erased everything from her vision. The audience, the hundreds of faces she had been dreading, were reduced to a faceless black void. She could feel their collective gaze, though, a palpable weight that pressed down on her. The walk to the piano felt like it took 1,000 years. Each step was an effort, her shoes sticking slightly to the polished wooden floor. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, a huge, gleaming black monster. Waiting for her dot, she saw the front row, a collection of sharp, shadowy figures. And there, in the very center, was the unmistakable, ramrod-straight silhouette of Madame Dubois. Even in the blinding light, Ilara could feel her teacher's eyes on her. Sharp and analytical, waiting for the inevitable failure, she reached the bench and slowly, carefully, sat down. The plush velvet was soft beneath her, but it felt like the edge of a cliff. She adjusted the stool, a small, familiar ritual that offered a sliver of comfort in the overwhelming terror. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air tasting of dust and hot lights. She raised her hands, holding them over the keys for a moment, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. It was a heavy, crushing silence, filled with expectation and pity. It was the silence of a crowd gathered to watch a spectacle. Her fingers, cold and stiff, settled onto the ivory keys. The world held its breath. And so did she? For a moment, the world was just the feel of the cool ivory keys under her shaking fingers. The silence in the auditorium was so complete it felt like a physical presence, a heavy blanket pressing down on her, smothering her. She could feel the collective gaze of hundreds of people, a weight that was almost too much to bear. In the front row, she could sense the still, watchful form of Madame Dubois, a predator waiting for the kill. There was no escape. There was only the piano and the impossible task ahead. Taking a breath that felt more like a gasp, Ilara began. The opening notes of La Campanella were supposed to be light, sparkling, and incredibly fast. They were meant to be like little bells, clear and precise. But what came out under her trembling fingers was a mess. The notes were clumsy, heavy, and slightly off rhythm. A wrong note clanged out, harsh and jarring in the quiet hall like a scream in a library. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She could feel a wave of second-hand embarrassment wash over the room. She tried to correct course, to push her fingers to move faster, to find the impossible agility the piece demanded. But her hands were not her own. They were stiff, foreign objects controlled by fear. Another fumbled passage, another discordant sound. It was exactly the disaster everyone had expected. It was the humiliation Madame d'Aubray had so carefully engineered that she could feel the tears welling up behind her eyes, hot and stinging. "This is it," a voice in her head whispered. "This is the end." Her fingers faltered, stumbling over a series of rapid 16th notes. The music ground to a halt, dying in a choked, incomplete chord. The silence that followed was even worse than before. It was a silence thick with pity and disappointment. She could almost hear the thoughts of the audience. Asterisk, poor girl. She wasn't ready. It was cruel to make her do this. Asterisk, she imagined Madame d'Aubre's thin, satisfied smile. Her hands hovered over the keys, frozen. She was about to stand up, to mumble an apology, to run off the stage and disappear forever. But then something strange happened. As she sat there, in the heart of her failure, a different feeling began to bubble up from deep inside her. It wasn't the terror from before. It was something else. It was a quiet, stubborn spark of anger. Not a blazing fire, but a single, steady flame. No, the thought came, clear and strong. No, this is not how my story ends. She thought again of her grandmother's old piano, of the sun-drenched afternoon, of the simple, joyful melody she had created just for herself. That was what music was. Not this. Not this terrifying, cold test of speed and precision. This was a cage. And she had been led into it willingly, without consciously deciding to. Her right hand, which had been frozen in mid-air, slowly descended back to the keyboard. It landed on a single key in the middle of the piano. She pressed it down, holding the note gently. It was a simple, clear C. The note hung in the silent air, pure and alone. It was a question. It was a statement. It was the sound of a moment of perfect stillness in the middle of a storm, and then, from that single note, something new began to happen. Her left hand, moving with a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere outside of herself, found a few quiet, simple chords. They were dark and melancholic, but not sad. They were thoughtful, like the sound of rain on a window pane. The sea she was still holding became the anchor, the center of this new, unexpected world she was creating. She had completely abandoned the list. The frantic, demanding score might as well have been on the moon. This new music was not technically difficult. There were no blindingly fast runs, no terrifying leaps. It was a simple melody, slowly unfolding, note by note. It was the kind of music she used to play when no one was listening. It was the music of her own soul. And as she played, the fear began to drain away, replaced by a deep, profound sense of calm. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying slightly. She was no longer on a stage in front of 100 critical strangers. She was back in that little room, telling a story with the only voice she had ever truly trusted. The melody she was creating spoke of the confusion and hurt of the last few hours. It had the sharp, staccato pain of a wrong note, followed by the soft, legato ache of a disappointment. It captured the feeling of being small and misunderstood, of having your dearest gift dismissed as a flaw. But as the music continued, it began to change. The melancholic chords in her left hand began to warm, to gain a subtle strength. The melody in her right hand began to climb, not with a desperate leap, but with a slow, determined step. It was the sound of someone finding their footing in the dark. It was the sound of a quiet, inner voice saying, "I am still here." Out in the audience, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The initial pity had vanished, replaced by a rapt, almost sacred attention. People leaned forward in their seats. The drama of the setup, the spectacle of the expected failure, it all melted away. There was only the music and the girl making it. An old man in the 10th row, a retired music teacher who had heard it all, found a tear tracing a path down his wrinkled cheek. He didn't know what she was playing, but he knew what she was saying. He understood the language of the heart. A young woman in the back who had come to support a friend found herself holding her breath, her own forgotten disappointments and quiet struggles echoing in the simple, Haunting melody. This was the emotion Madame Dubois had so scorned. But it wasn't sentimental or indulgent. It was real. It was raw. It was the sound of a human being laid bare. The music was no longer a performance. It was a confession. It was an act of incredible bravery. She was taking the very thing she had been criticized for her feeling, and she was amplifying it, not with noise and speed, but with quiet, unwavering honesty. She was taking the weapon her teacher had used against her, the expectation of failure, and turning it into something beautiful and strong. The piece she was improvising had no name, but it had a story. And everyone in that silent hall was listening. The melody she had woven from the threads of her own fear found its final resting place. It didn't end with a crash or a triumphant shout, but with a series of soft, descending notes like a sigh of release. Her right hand played a gentle, questioning phrase, and her left hand answered with a warm, reassuring chord. It was a conversation of forgiveness, not with her teacher, but with herself. Forgive yourself for being afraid. Forgive yourself for not being perfect. Forgive yourself for feeling. The final chord she played was not a single note, but a simple, open harmony that hung in the air like a benediction. It was the sound of peace. She let her fingers rest on the keys, the vibration of the last sound fading into a silence, so profound it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. In that silence, no one moved. The 100 or so people in the auditorium remained perfectly still, captured in the web of emotion she had spun. The harsh, judgmental atmosphere that had filled the hall at the beginning of her performance had been completely purged. In its place was a shared, sacred space of vulnerability and connection. A young man in a cheap suit who had come to impress a date found himself blinking back tears, thinking of a dream he had abandoned years ago. A mother, who had pushed her own child relentlessly in sports, felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret, wondering if she had ever stopped to listen to what her child truly felt. The music had been a mirror, and in its simple, honest reflection, everyone saw a piece of their own quiet struggles, their own hidden heartaches, and their own deep-seated longing for acceptance. The silence was not empty. It was filled with 1,000 unspoken stories, all brought to the surface by a girl at a piano who had dared to be real. Then, from the back of the hall, a single sound broke the spell. It was the clap of one pair of hands. It wasn't loud or demanding, but clear and steady. It was the sound of deep, genuine appreciation. It was the old music teacher, his face wet with tears, showing his gratitude in the only way he could. That single clap was like a spark in a dry forest. Another person joined in, then another, and another. The sound grew, not into polite, rhythmic clapping, but into a chaotic, emotional roar. It was an explosion of feeling that the audience could no longer contain. People were on their feet before they even realized it, their bodies rising as if pulled by an invisible string. The applause was thunderous, a wall of sound that shook the very foundations of the old hall. It was not the applause for a technical virtuoso who had conquered a difficult piece. It was the applause for a brave soul who had conquered her own fear and, in doing so, had touched theirs. The sound finally reached Elara, pulling her out of the deep trance she had been in. She opened her eyes, which were still wet with her own tears, and saw it. The faceless black void of the audience was now a sea of standing figures, a blur of motion and sound. They were all on their feet. The thunder was for her. A wave of shock, followed by a wave of overwhelming warmth, washed over her. She had expected pity or worse, laughter. She had prepared herself for shame, but this was something she could never have imagined. They had understood. They hadn't come to see a spectacle of failure. They had come to listen, and she had given them something real to hear. The tears that flowed now were not tears of hurt or fear, but tears of pure, unadulterated release. It was the feeling of a dam breaking, of a pressure that had been building for years finally being let go. Her eyes scanned the front row, moving past the other shocked faculty members and the stern-faced critics. They found her, the one person whose reaction she both dreaded and needed to see. Madame Dubois was still in her seat, the only person in the entire front row who had not stood up. But her composure was gone. Her ramrod-straight posture had collapsed, her shoulders slumped slightly. Her hands, which were always so still and controlled, were gripping the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. Her face, usually a mask of icy calm, was a canvas of raw, unguarded emotion. It was a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else that looked suspiciously like awe. She looked like a cartographer who had just discovered that the map she had spent, her entire life drawing, was of a world that didn't exist. Ilara's music, this simple, honest, sentimental music, had just dismantled her teacher's entire, rigidly constructed worldview. Brick by brick. In that moment, Ilara felt no sense of victory. There was no triumph, no smug satisfaction. There was only a profound, quiet understanding. She saw not a cruel teacher, but a lonely woman who had locked her own heart away in a cage of perfection and had forgotten how to find the key. The lesson in humility had indeed been taught, but the student was not the one on the stage. Madame Dubois had set out to prove that emotion was a weakness, and instead, she had been confronted with the irrefutable proof that it was the greatest strength of all. Slowly, Ilara stood up from the piano bench. The roar of the crowd intensified. She gave a small, shy nod, not like a performer taking a bow, but like a quiet person saying thank you for a great kindness. She didn't try to speak. There were no words that could have added to what she had already said with the music. She turned and walked off the stage, her steps light and steady for the first time that night. She left the thundering applause behind her, a beautiful, chaotic sound that would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. Backstage, in the quiet shadows, she leaned against the cool wall and closed her eyes, a single, peaceful smile finally gracing her lips. She had gone out to face a monster, and in the process she had found her own voice. And it was more than enough.